Imagine you're sitting at your dinner table, the same way you have for years. Nothing feels out of place until you hear a strange sound in the hallway. You get up, walk toward the door, and before you can reach the knob, something crashes into you from behind. You hit the floor, stunned. And what is going to happen to you next will shock the entire nation. This story begins with a woman named Katherine Knight. And if you've never heard of her, well, by the end of this story, you'll wish you hadn't. Katherine Mary Knight was born on October 24th, 1955, in the small town of Tenterfield, New South Wales, Australia. Her life began surrounded by scandal and dysfunction. Her mother, Barbara Ruffin, had 4 sons with her husband, Jack Ruffin. During their marriage, Barbara began a relationship with Ken Knight, a co-worker of her husband's. When this affair became public, the backlash in their conservative community was so strong that Barbara and Ken were forced to relocate to the town of Moree. Ken Knight, Katherine's father, was a troubled man. He drank heavily and often treated Barbara with aggression and cruelty. According to family accounts, Barbara frequently spoke about these experiences with her daughters in a manner that was unfiltered and deeply inappropriate. These conversations, full of bitterness and resentment, had a lasting impact on Katherine, shaping her early views on relationships, power, and gender. Katherine later alleged that she was mistreated by several members of her extended family during childhood. Although these claims were not formally investigated, other relatives acknowledged that something may have occurred, lending credibility to her story. Whether every detail was ever fully known or not, it's clear her upbringing was shaped by emotional instability, fear, and unresolved trauma. At school, Katherine was unpredictable. Teachers said she showed potential at times, but she also had sudden outbursts. She once physically attacked a boy with a weapon, and, in another case, a teacher had to defend themselves from her aggression. Despite this behavior, she could also be quiet, withdrawn, and socially isolated. It was clear that something was deeply fractured beneath the surface. She left school at 15 without having fully learned to read or write and took a job in a clothing factory. But it was not long before she pursued the job she truly wanted, working at the local abattoir in Aberdeen. She began in the offal room, but quickly stood out for her skill and determination. She was soon promoted and given her own set of butchery knives. These knives became prized possessions. She kept them mounted above her bed, explaining that she liked to have them close by, in case she needed them. At the time, it was an odd quirk. In hindsight, it was deeply unsettling. The slaughterhouse wasn't just employment for Katherine, it was a place that matched her inner world. The daily routine of ending life, handling meat and bone, and moving through rooms filled with noise and blood didn't seem to disturb her. It became familiar, routine, comforting. In this environment, she gained not only confidence, but a sense of control. This was the foundation upon which everything else was built. A childhood shaped by volatility, an environment filled with emotional neglect, and a job that normalized power over life and death. Katherine Knight had found both a role and a method, one that would eventually lead her far beyond violence into something truly horrific. The men who entered her life were either driven away or left deeply scarred. David Kellett. Katherine met David Kellett in 1973. He was a co-worker at the slaughterhouse and, like Katherine, had endured personal trauma. Kellett struggled with alcohol and carried emotional wounds from a series of tragic events, including witnessing a colleague's death. Their connection was fast, and within a year, they were married. The marriage started with warning signs. At their wedding, Barbara, Katherine's mother, reportedly pulled David aside and told him her daughter had a dangerous temper. The comment wasn't taken seriously enough. On their wedding night, David later claimed that Katherine tried to strangle him because he fell asleep after only being intimate a few times. It wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout their relationship, Katherine's temper would flare with frightening intensity. On one occasion, she struck David in the head with a frying pan, causing a serious injury. Despite all this, the couple stayed together for several years and had a daughter, Melissa Ann. David eventually left after the violence escalated beyond his ability to cope. Katherine, in response, suffered a mental breakdown. She was later seen pushing their baby in a stroller, violently shaking it from side to side. She was hospitalized and treated for mental health concerns, though she was released shortly after. The root issues remained unaddressed. David Saunders, possession and threat, A few years later, Katherine entered a relationship with David Saunders, a former minor. Early on, he moved in with her and brought along his dingo pup. As their relationship grew, Katherine's need for control became apparent. She constantly accused him of infidelity, despite no evidence. Her possessiveness turned to intimidation. In one of the more disturbing incidents, she reportedly killed his puppy in front of him as a form of warning. It was a brutal message. She expected loyalty and submission. Afterward, she would threaten, stalk, and physically assault him. At one point, she struck him with an iron and stabbed him with scissors. When he fled, she attempted to follow and manipulate her way back into his life. John Chillingworth, a temporary calm. Katherine's next partner was John Chillingworth, with whom she had another son, Eric. For a time, the relationship was more stable, by her standards, but it too began to show cracks. Arguments, mistrust, and emotional volatility began to rise again. The cycle was repeating. Eventually, she left Chillingworth for another man, John Charles Thomas Price. John Price, the final partner. John Price, known to friends as Pricey, was a respected father of three and well-liked in his community. He was aware of Katherine's past. Her temper was no secret, but their initial romance seemed manageable. They lived together, shared responsibilities, and for a time, things were relatively calm. That calm didn't last. Price refused to marry her, and this triggered repeated conflicts. After a dispute, Katherine took revenge by filming and submitting a video to his employer, showing stolen items he had taken years earlier from work. Price lost his job, and though he briefly threw her out, he later let her return. The relationship continued, but it was deteriorating. Friends began to notice Price's demeanor changing. He was anxious, weary, and increasingly afraid. He told co-workers he feared for his life and even joked that if he ever disappeared, it would be because Katherine killed me. It was no joke. By early 2000, John Price was trapped in a relationship he no longer wanted but could not safely escape. Friends and co-workers had become concerned for his well-being. He told them repeatedly that Katherine Knight had become unpredictable and dangerous. In the weeks leading up to his death, he voiced his fear plainly. If anything were to happen to him, it would be her doing. On February 29, 2000, Price went to a local magistrate and filed for a restraining order to keep Katherine away from both himself and his children. That same day, he told colleagues that he believed she would kill him and that he wasn't going to survive the week. He returned home after work, following his usual routine. Friends begged him not to, but he felt he had no real options left. That night, Price followed his regular routine: dinner, TV, and bed by 11 p.m. Unbeknownst to him, Katherine was already preparing her final act. She arrived at the house sometime later, letting herself in with a key she had previously duplicated. She cooked a meal, watched TV, and then entered Price's bedroom. Reports from the crime scene suggested that they had been intimate one final time before he fell asleep. What happened next was methodical and fatal. In the early hours of March 1st, 2000, while Price was asleep, Katherine retrieved a large butcher's knife and attacked him in bed. He woke during the assault and tried to escape, but she pursued him through the house. Evidence showed that he made it to the front door, even opened it, but collapsed just outside. Katherine dragged him back inside. What followed was one of the most disturbing crime scenes in modern Australian history. Later that morning, when Price failed to show up for work, his employer grew concerned and sent a colleague to check on him. After receiving no response at the door, police were called. What they discovered inside was gruesome and beyond what even seasoned officers had seen before. John Price was deceased. His body had been subjected to extensive post-mortem mutilation. Police found Katherine unconscious on the bed, having taken a large dose of medication in what appeared to be an attempted overdose. She survived. Though she initially claimed to have no memory of the event, the evidence left no doubt. Katherine Knight had planned and executed the murder, then attempted to erase herself from the consequences, but her attempt to escape justice would fail. The crime scene at John Price's house was unlike anything the New South Wales police had encountered. Detectives and forensic teams worked in silence, shaken by the brutality and precision of what they found. Katherine Knight was quickly identified as the only suspect, and although she was hospitalized under sedation after her overdose attempt, the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic investigation painted a chilling picture of what had occurred after the murder. Price had suffered multiple stab wounds, 29 in total. The distribution of the injuries showed that he had tried to escape but was overwhelmed. After his death, Knight committed further acts that went far beyond violence, reflecting a disturbing need for control and retribution. Details of the scene were so extreme that photographs from the investigation have been permanently sealed by the court due to their graphic nature. Knight had written a note, found on top of a photograph of Price, in which she accused him of various wrongdoings involving his children. Investigators believed this was her attempt to rationalize the crime, to leave behind a justification for what she had done. But the claims she made in the note were baseless, and no evidence ever supported them. It was not a message of remorse, but one of blame. As Knight recovered in the hospital under police guard, formal charges were prepared. She was arrested and charged with the murder of John Price. Her mental state became the central focus of both the investigation and the legal proceedings that followed. Mental health assessments. Katherine underwent multiple psychological evaluations. Experts debated whether she was suffering from a mental illness that could explain or mitigate her actions. Some found signs of borderline personality disorder. Others pointed to her history of childhood trauma and unresolved emotional damage. However, no assessment concluded that she was legally insane. She was found fit to stand trial. She understood what she had done, and more importantly, she understood that it was wrong. Knight's trial was scheduled for October 2001 at the Supreme Court in New South Wales. Initially, she entered a plea of not guilty. The case was set to proceed with a full jury trial, and over 60 witnesses were expected to testify. But on the day the trial began, she changed her plea to guilty without explanation. This decision shocked everyone involved. The presiding judge, Justice Barry O'Keefe, ordered that she undergo one final psychiatric evaluation to ensure that she understood the consequences of her plea. The court was satisfied with the result. Knight knew exactly what she was doing. Because of the guilty plea, the gruesome evidence did not have to be presented in open court. The jury was dismissed, and sentencing moved forward. On November 8, 2001, Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australian history to receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole.